What's up everyone, welcome to this week's video. If you're new here, my name is Steele, and this is a channel all about photography, editing tutorials, and everything under the photography realm that can basically transform you into a hobbyist photographer and someone that is able to capture some great memories of your friends, family, and yourself. If you've been keeping up with the series, then this is episode 4 of my Lightroom Masterclass, and this is going to wrap up all of the remaining panels that we have in Lightroom today. So we'll be going over lens corrections, transform, effects, and the tone curve. After all said and done, next week's episode we have episode 5, which is the finale of the series, which goes into presets, which basically takes all the knowledge that we learned in the past videos and combines them into a one-clicked editing effect that allows you to edit your images very fast and share your knowledge with your friends and other people. So if all of that sounds interesting to you, then stay subscribed and hit the bell to make sure you're notified for the most recent video. And in the future there will be a Photoshop editing series as well as more quick tips and tricks to help you guys learn something new every week. But without further ado, let's hop right into the video. These panels are filled with a ton of stuff, but there's actually not too much to learn, so hopefully this is a quick episode this week. Alright, hopping into our first image, we have one of our images that we've been using all series here, and we're going to hop into the lens correction tab here, which has two main functions, which is to remove chromatic aberration and enable lens profile corrections. Both of these are to fix the imperfections that our lenses have. Chromatic aberration is something that we could see in this photo that I found on the internet because it's actually something that doesn't show up too often in your lenses. Basically, it is this weird fringing that happens around the edge of your photos here, and this usually happens in the magenta and the green spectrum, but for this example, it is magenta and blue. And usually if you click this button to remove chromatic aberrations, then this will completely remove all of the fringing in your photo, but sometimes it does become very dramatic, especially if you have a lens that's shot wide open during the bright day. So if you have this hard fringing that's not going away with this one click, you can go into this manual tab here and you can actually go and crank up this, which will remove the chromatic aberration by this amount inside of this color spectrum. So you can go ahead and adjust this color spectrum until it covers all of those colors, and then just crank that amount until all of that color goes away. And you can see what the removal of chromatic aberration does is basically desaturate that fringe area. So it's something that we want to be careful with, because if we go too far, we can actually remove colors that we don't want from our image. So as you see, if we go down to this green slider over here and we want to remove some of this red, we can go ahead and crank this up a little bit, which will get rid of some of that color that we don't want. But if we move this slider over too much, you see we got rid of the green hue and the green color of the leaves that we didn't want to. So just be careful if you go into the manual section. But like I said, most likely you will not have to. You can just go into this profile section. And if we go back to this image that has probably very minimal chromatic aberration, if any, if we remove chromatic aberration, then anything that was in the image will disappear. The second part of the lens correction tab is the enable profile corrections, and basically when shooting a wide lens or any lens in general, there are two imperfections, which is a little bit of distortion around these edges as well as a vignette. And this happens because the lens is curved, and because of this curvature, the image is not perfectly smooth. The sensor is flat and the lens is curved, so the image that gets projected onto the sensor is not perfect. So these profile corrections kind of basically change the image, so if the light hit the sensor correctly, it would be a perfect image. So if we go ahead here, you'll see that this will most likely brighten the edges of the side here, and then it will actually zoom in a little bit to stretch that image out as if there was no distortion. So I'll just flick this on and off a few times so you guys can see what that does. And also, most of the time it will select the correct lens for you because this tool is very smart. But if you cannot, then there's a huge database of information here, and you could find any lens. I shoot with Leica, so I could find a Leica Summilux 35mm that I usually shoot with, and you can see that this actually selects that. And then if that's still not good enough for you, most likely you won't have to. You can actually change these amounts here for the distortion, the vignette in, but that's not something I think you're going to have to do, so I won't even show you. Just go to the lens that you have. As you see, this is the correct one, and that fixes the image real quick. So the next tab that we have is the transform tab, and I'm going to go over this very quickly. Whereas the lens correction tab fixed our corner distortion, this transform tab will actually go ahead and try to fix the distortion that's found completely inside of more wider lenses or images taken at a weird angle. So this will go ahead and try to straighten all of the lines in our photo. As you can see, this line here and this line here are not completely straight actually. So if we go ahead and hit auto, this will actually try to straighten these lines as well as the other lines in our photos to give us a more complete image, which is something that is very helpful. Sometimes this auto doesn't work, so we can go ahead and select some of these other options like level, which will try to fix certain lines, vertical, which will try to fix other sets of lines, and full, which will also try to fix lines. And as you see, the more we try to completely fix this image, the more distorted it gets because our lenses are not perfect. So this would be a perfectly straight photo, but as you can see, it completely distorts this car here. So you have to use your own discretion when you are editing these images, and most likely auto is something that is good. And if this is not good enough for you, or if you're a true perfectionist, you could actually go down here and edit all of these by yourself, but it's something that's very hard. It can definitely ruin your image if you're not careful with it, so I don't recommend doing that. I just recommend hitting auto. So if none of these are working on an image and you're ending up with some weird effects, you can actually go into the guided section here, which allows you to draw lines that you want to be straight in your photo. So if I wanted to straighten this pole here, I could go ahead and draw one line here, and nothing happens yet because this is only one point of reference. But we could go down to this house over here and try to draw a straight line over here as well. And now you're going to go ahead and see that this image straightened around these two lines. And then if I want to straighten this final pole over here, we can go ahead and straighten that. And now you can see the image is straight on those three planes. But you can see we'd probably have to crop in a little bit because of the way the image is affected. But that's one way that you can change your image to get it straight as well. So hopping back into our original image, like I said, I fully recommend just using auto here. And then recapping on the lens corrections, just click these two boxes, and 9 out of 10 times, both of these two corrections for your image will make it better. This is what we started with. You could see it is a little darker in the corners and a little distorted, and this is where we got after clicking 3 buttons. Next, we'll hop into the detail tab, and the first thing that we have here is sharpening. And sharpening is a great tool because it can really make our image sharp if we're not using some great lenses, or if we're already using great lenses, it can make our image sharper than it was before. So as we go into this, we could really crank sharpening up, but this should kind of ruin our image because too much sharpening is definitely not good for the photo. Definitely didn't show too much here, but there is a lot of sharpening down here. You can see these weird patterns and effects in the image, and we definitely don't want this. We definitely want to keep it around what they had, so it just adds a little bit of edge sharpening. But one cool thing about this sharpening is that I usually don't affect the radius or the detail because that can definitely also mess with the sharpening. But this masking slider here, if you hold down the Alt key on your keyboard, you could actually impact the area of your image that you want to be sharpened. And this is good because you don't want to sharpen areas like the paint and the walls. For this image, I really just want to sharpen the sign and the headlights. So I can go ahead and crank this up till I'm only affecting areas like that. And then if we go down here and then we crank sharpening up a lot more, you'll see that now this is very sharp, which still has that weird pattern. I still don't recommend cranking up that high, but this paint area is not impacted by that sharpness. So you could go ahead and put it somewhere in the middle, probably around 70, and that's going to sharpen the image a lot while leaving areas like this wall completely smooth. The next part of this tab is the noise reduction, and basically this is going to fix the grain in your image that is caused by shooting at too high of an ISO, or if you exposed your image too much in Lightroom by pulling up the shadows and pulling up the blacks, then you could get some weird grain that is artificially added to a photo. So if I hop into this film photo here that I exposed for the sky, if I go into the basic section and I pull up the shadows and pull up the exposure, you can see that now there is some artificial grain inside of this tree. The grain inside of this tree is both purple and green, so we could tell that this is noise, but it is more specifically, it is color noise. So if we go back into our detail tab, we see that we have a luminance noise reduction and a color noise reduction. And we're going to go ahead, and since this is color noise, we're going to go ahead and bring this up to remove that color noise. And now you can see this tree is more gray and black, which is the correct color of the tree, which really helps remove all of that weird noise and effect that we get in our images that we don't want. Flicking this on and off so you can see how that impacts the image, but you can see it leaves most of that luminance noise that we have in our image. And to me personally, I don't like to remove this luminance noise, because if we go ahead and bring this slider up to remove this noise, you're going to see that it really softens the image out. And this actually adds a very bad look to an image, in my opinion. It just looks like the photo is out of focus and shot with a very cheap lens. So although there is noise in this area, I'd rather have the noise than remove it. I do like to remove the color noise though. And as for both of these, I definitely don't like to mess with the detail and the contrast too much, or the detail and the smoothness, because usually you can get some really weird side effects if you start playing with these. The default options are pretty good. If you're not happy with them, go ahead and play with the detail and smoothness and detail and contrast. But usually just bring up the color noise reduction to remove that weird color, and bring up the noise reduction no more than 5 or 10, because otherwise your image is going to get very smooth and not look natural. So we're going to hop back into this first image here, and I'm actually going to cheat a little bit, and I am going to throw on a preset from next week's video that we're going to see, and this is just going to show us a little bit what the effects do inside of this. So if we hop into the effects tab, we could see that we have post-crop vignetting and we have grain, and both these are style choices here. These are not really corrections, these kind of just add a certain flair to the image, and most often you see people darken the corners of their image to bring more detail and attraction to the center. Very rarely do you see someone bring brightness to the corner. It adds kind of a cheap old photo effect, which could be pretty cool. I mean, it kind of looks cool in this image, but it's not something I would post anywhere. It definitely looks fake. But a lot of people will bring down that corner vignetting, because even if you do it pretty drastically, sometimes people might not even notice it. But this is something that I do play with these sliders on. Most often I just bring down the amount a little bit, but if you really wanted to, if I bring down this all the way, you can see how this vignette will change. The midpoint basically impacts where the vignette starts and finishes, so I usually leave this at the normal amount. The roundness changes to the photo, so you can make this look into a complete circle, or you can make this more shaped to the outside and only affect the corners. If anything, I would make it more circlish, I think, which is fine. And then the feather impacts how much of this basically feathers off, as you know. So it can become very sharp, which is not something we want, or it can become very, very soft, which is something that is good. So as you can see, I'll just bring this feather down all the way, and then you can see this is how the midpoint impacts the vignette, and then this is how the roundness impacts the vignette. So most of the time you don't want to play too much with these, but also you can take this vignette out of the highlights, as you see. That's not something that I usually do either. If I'm going to be playing around with this, I'm usually just bringing down this vignette a little bit, just to bring a little more detail and attraction to the center, but no more than that. And then lastly, in our effects tab, we have the grain slider, so we can go ahead and bring this grain tab all the way up here. And as you can see, this adds kind of a filmic look to the photo. It adds grain, and most people don't like this because you try to avoid grain when you're printing professionally and stuff. But when it comes to adding some style into your photo, you can go ahead and add a ton of grain into your image. And this can look weird if you crank it up all the way. You can see this looks like a very sharp image, definitely added some grain effect. But if you're pretty subtle with this and you added around like 30, then it could add a nice texture to your image and even flatten out some areas if you do a rough job somewhere. This kind of adds a little bit of a roll off to the image because it kind of adds an even texture to the image that smooths it out in a certain way. As with the other stuff, I usually don't play around with the size and the roughness. This can really mess up the look of the grain, and I think the default is pretty good. It usually adds a decent texture to the image that I'm pretty happy between 25 and 50 with. Alright, and now we are hopping into the final part of our image, which is the tone curve. I have avoided the tone curve, and I am not a big fan of the tone curve because this is a way to completely ruin your image. But it also is a way, if you're very masterful and very skillful, it is a way to add a very nice style into your image. And as you can see, the tone curve is broken up into 5 sections up here. The first tone curve is an all-around tone curve, but it kind of lets you edit in a more smooth way. And then this is an all-around tone curve, except you can really mess with the points. And then this is a red, green, and blue version of this all-around tone curve that allows you to add color and other effects into certain tonal values of your image. So how does this tone curve work? If you remember anything from the histogram video, this over here is the black pixel, as well as you can see how many pixels are around that black area. It is a very high amount. Over here is the white pixel, and this is how many pixels are in that area. And over here is the grayish pixels, and you can see these are the amount of pixels that are in that gray area. This tone curve right here represents the actual value that the pixel is projecting. So on this x-axis over here, like I said, you have the black pixel all the way over here, you have the middle gray pixels going along here, and then all the way at this end of the x-axis, you have the white pixel. And on this y-axis, underneath, you have the number of pixels, which you could see in the normal histogram, but for the tone curve, this y-axis also represents that black pixel all the way down here, and this white pixel all the way up here. So what that means is that this curve represents what output each pixel will truly have. So up here, this white pixel is projecting the white pixel. Down here, the black pixel is projecting the black pixel. And in the middle, this middle gray pixel is projecting the middle gray pixel. But if we go ahead and drag this down over here, you can see that this middle gray pixel has skewed from this line. This middle gray pixel is now projecting a middle gray pixel that is darker than it should be. And this is easily seen when we go over into the point curve over here, and if we add some points, we can take this black point over here, so this black pixel is projecting the black pixel, but if we pull this up, you'll see that the black pixel will now project a gray pixel. So if we go ahead, this is called muting our blacks. You could see the black pixel is no longer black, it is actually a gray pixel. So, as you see in our histogram, there is no black inside of our image anymore. It is crushed, and now we can see that there is only a gray pixel. This is now the new darkest part of our image, can be no darker than this point that we dragged on, because all of the black pixels are now projecting a brighter gray color. So this is super powerful, because if you play with this tone curve, you can limit your histogram, which is something that we usually don't like to do. So if we go ahead, we can also do this to the white side, and whereas these pixels are projecting very close to the white pixel, if we pull this down, now these white pixels are now projecting a medium gray pixel. So as you see, this has severely crushed our histogram. Every single one of the pixels that were over here in this area now got pushed into this pixel range, and you could see that with this giant spike in this area. This is super powerful because very rarely do you want to crush your zone by this much, but if you do, it can definitely add a style to your photos that cannot be replicated in many other ways. I'm not someone that usually brings up my blacks that much or brings down my whites that much, but if you want to, this is the way that you can do it. So the reason that this point curve is a little more interesting is we can actually click right here and we can drag which part of our image is that we want. So if we like that our image is projecting this color, then we don't touch it. But if we want our blacks down here to project a brighter color, we can go ahead and raise this. And as you can see, with this curve, this is a very nice soft curve. It doesn't really crush your image that much, which is one of the benefits of using this first curve. But if you go into this section here, you actually can drop points along this curve right here, and they're not as forgiving. They really let you pull this in any way you want. So if I wanted to do that same thing, as you can see, I pulled up the gray pixels in this area. If I wanted to do that in this area, you can see that it can start to really mess up the image, and I could actually pull this way too far, and you can see once pixels on this left side are projecting pixels brighter than the image on the right side, it creates this very weird effect because your roll off, where your shadows should roll off into the black, your shadows start rolling off into a brighter color, which really ruins the image. So if you really wanted to mess your image up, you could see you can get a very wonky tone curve here, and it just starts projecting pixels in all the wrong places. So you have to be very careful with your tone curve. Otherwise, your image is going to look super weird. But like I said, if you're being artistic, you can definitely create something cool with this, I'm sure. But if you have no idea what you're doing, you can ruin your tone curve because now this dark gray pixel is projecting a white, and this bright gray pixel is projecting a middle gray, and it is just messed up all of the colors and everything in the image. So we're just going to go ahead and reset this. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a few common tone curves then, because if the tone curve is so strong, then what would you do with it? Well, there's a few things. One is called the S curve, and this can go in either way. An S curve adds contrast because if you make these gray pixels darker and you make these gray pixels brighter, you're essentially adding more contrast into your image, which you can watch happen live here on this histogram. So if we go ahead and bring this down, you can see that the contrast starts to add up over here. And if you bring this up, the same thing, you get more contrast, which you could see with this U shape in your histogram. And now you can see this added way too much contrast into the image, but it definitely added contrast. So most people, when they're playing around with this curve, they add 5 points, and they just bring this tone curve down just a tiny bit here, and a tiny bit here, and that just adds a little bit of contrast to the image, which is pleasing. The other way you can take this is you can take these grays and you could bring them up a little bit, and you could bring these grays and bring them down a little bit, and now you've taken contrast out of your image. So now we can see we have less contrast when we add this tone curve. Then we're going to go ahead and add those 5 points again one more time. And kind of like what I showed you before, there is a stylish way to add the grays into your blacks and the grays into your whites, but you want to be careful. I usually add one more point here just as safety, because the more points you have, the less sensitive this line becomes. And I'd go ahead and just bring this up just a tiny bit here, and you can see it's limited the histogram a little bit, but not too much. This adds a little bit of that film flare, and you might not be able to see it that much on the video, but it definitely adds a lot to the image. And same here, if you want to do it to your whites, you can go ahead and pull down the whites in this area, and you can see that that has just muted the image a little bit. And then you could go ahead and you could even add contrast to this image, so you could go ahead and pull this down a little bit, pull this up a little bit. So now you've muted your blacks, muted your whites, and you've added a tone curve into your image that has drastically impacted the look of your image. So now you've just learned a ton about the tone curve, but we still haven't went into the red, green, and blue sections of our tone curve. So what could those possibly do if this is projecting the black pixel, white pixel, black pixel, white pixel, and this line is what they're actually projecting? What does the red one do? And luckily Lightroom actually updated this, so it's a little more easier to see, but this over here represents, the red pixel on the dark side, and this over here represents the red pixel on the bright side. And if you wanted to add more red into these pixels, you would pull this curve up. That adds more red into the image. If you wanted to add less red into these pixels, so basically taking red away, you pull the curve down. But when you take red away from the image, you actually add cyan into the image. So if I go ahead and just add 1 point here as an example, if I add red into this image, you can see that this adds red to all these pixels, because all of these pixels are now projecting a higher red value than they were projecting before. But if I go down here and I pull this down, all of these pixels are now projecting less red than they were before, which allows cyan to be a lot more prevalent in the image. So we can go ahead and see the greens. Same thing with the greens. We can impact the green output or take the green output away, which adds magenta into the image. Or we could even go into the blues, which is probably the most favorable tone curve of mine because these are some easy colors to work with. You can add a little bit of blue to your image to cool it off, or you could take blue away to warm it up. So that is all the tone curves, and for these color ones, these ones are really artistic, you could see each time you go into the red, green, and blue, it shows you the amount of color that those pixels already have. So these histograms are completely different than this exposure histogram. This exposure histogram is all of these histograms combined, but this itself does not impact the color besides the saturation, of course. So one example that I would do here is I would still add my 5 points into this image, and it's very sensitive. It's when you add these points, sometimes you might drag them down, which you don't want to do. But for me, if I just wanted to add a little bit of yellow into my shadows, I could go ahead and pull this way. This is going to pull a little bit of yellows into the shadows, but you can see as it does that, it makes the curve point up, which adds a little bit of blue into this tone. So if you didn't want that to happen, you could add another point and just like kind of even this out. Or if you don't want to add yellow to your shadows at all, which I'm not sure if you do or don't, then you could go ahead and you could add yellow to the highlights over here by pulling this down. This is going to warm up the highlights. And with all of these, you just have to be very subtle and basically keep checking your image, because if you're not, you can definitely add some weird effects. But you could see this is where the yellow was added into the image because of that. It can be subtle, but if you pull it too far, like I said, it can really ruin your image, and you don't want that to happen because it's not something that looks good. It looks like you don't know how to use the tone curve. So the tone curve is definitely something you have to master, and because it impacts the image with no regard to the other settings, it is something that I recommend always doing last. So always play with the tone curve last after you've done your other edits, because this is where you really finalize your image. So the last thing that I will show you is that if we pull this down, we lose a part of our histogram. We lose this big chunk of our histogram over here, and vice versa over here, we lose a big chunk of our histogram over here. And just to be a little more dramatic, as you see, as we pull these closer, this image is basically just going to become one color pixel. But if we don't want this impact and we want to fix our image in a certain way, we can actually pull these in the other way. So since this image is lacking a lot of pixels in this brighter area, if we pull this to the left this way, we're keeping all of the range inside of our histogram, but now we're pulling all of our pixels into that direction, because all of these pixels are now being shifted and outputted, but the maximum pixel output is still the white pixel. And same down here, if we shift this black point over here, we're keeping all of our histogram values, but now our projection is a lot more contrasty. So this is one way you can go ahead and correct your images. If you have a very small dynamic range in your image and you can't recover that in the basic tab, you can go ahead into the tone curve and you can correct it that way. But just make sure you're not correcting it by pulling out the output, because this will reduce your dynamic range, whereas this will technically increase your dynamic range at the sacrifice of grouping a bunch of your pixels together. Now you can see a bunch of pixels are the black pixel. So just be careful with the tone curve. It's something that you definitely have to master. But that is it for the tone curve. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys again. This is the presets that we are going to learn in episode 5. This is a preset that I added just using the knowledge that I learned in this course, and it's going to be a very cool episode because all of the presets that you guys create you can use on certain scenarios and certain images to really add a one-click edit to your images, which is just an amazing thing to do. And presets is such a strong way to edit your photo and to learn, because if you're creating presets that are going to be used on all images, you realize that if you use the tone curve, you really have to be careful with your exposure value, because the tone curve only works on images with a histogram that looks like that image. So all of the knowledge that you've learned in these past 4 episodes are going to be used to create amazing presets that you can slap onto your images. So if you guys are interested in checking out the next episode, make sure to subscribe. But that's all for episode 4, which was all about corrections and the tone curve. I hope you guys learned a lot. But if you use these tips and tricks, make sure you tag me on Twitter, make sure you tag me on Instagram, because I love seeing your work and I repost all your work. All of my social links are in the description. But that's it for this video. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss episode 5, and also the new Photoshop Master Course and quicker tips and tricks coming to the channel. I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.